Welcome to Casual Friday. Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is my weekly Casual Friday podcast. Just as I do in my technique videos, I will include links down in the video description that allow you to jump backwards or forwards through the video from one section to another if you'd like. So this week I have 3 little quick tidbits I want to go over. Then I want to update you on my Roaring 20s vintage sweater project. And then I want to take a tour through 4 of the 1940s vintage knitting manuals that I recently purchased. So let's get started. So my first tidbit is a YouTube channel that I think some of you might really enjoy. Those of you who are interested in history and social history might find this fascinating. There is a term called mudlarking, which refers to people who scavenge for things on the banks of the River Thames. So the Thames River in London is very close to the ocean, and so it's affected by the tides. And so when the tide goes out and the riverbanks are exposed, it exposes this clay that's at the bottom of the river, and anything that gets stuck in that mud, whether it got stuck recently or hundreds of years ago, it doesn't really decay much because it's anaerobic. So there's no air can get in there, and there's nothing that's going to cause the stuff to just decay. So this woman has a permit to do this, and she's got friends who go along with her sometimes, and they share their finds. And she's also an artist, and there are other areas where she goes to look for various things, like she also looks for messages in bottles in this one particular place. To me, as an American, it's fascinating that she is finding like these clay pipes. And these are pipes like for smoking. They'll have a little bowl and have this long stem. And a lot of times they have little figures that are embossed in on the clay on the bowl of the pipe. But she'll find coins. Sometimes they find Roman coins, and she'll find jewelry sometimes, or little padlocks and pieces of glass that are embossed with somebody's name. So I'm finding out all sorts of really interesting things about how people lived in, hundreds of years ago in England. And I mean, the things that she finds are not things that you would find in rivers in the United States, because we don't have that kind of extended history of people living along the riverbanks and just using it as a dumping ground as they did on that particular river. And because of the particular qualities of the clay that's at the bottom of the river, the things that get stuck in there are really well preserved for centuries until they come out. So she'll show you what she finds as she finds it. And sometimes she's like, I don't know what this is, or she'll know immediately, oh, this is an 18th century clay pipe. She'll recognize some things right away, but she's got access to all kinds of databases, and sometimes she writes to archaeologists at local museums to try to find out how do I figure out what this is? And to me, it's really fascinating. So I thought I'd share that with you, and I'll put a link down to her YouTube channel down below because it's just fascinating. So the second tidbit is Finish It February is wrapping up tomorrow. So it's not too late to finish some things. I will do an official wrap up next week, and I'm hoping to include some project photos from some of you who have participated in it, so the rest of you can see what people have been accomplishing this month as they've gone through all of their old UFOs and made decisions about whether to say goodbye to them or to actually get them finished. So we'll be doing that wrap up next week. So the third thing is just to let people know that if you are wanting to contact me to get help with a knitting project, the way to do that is in my Ravelry group. And I always leave a link directly to my Ravelry group down in the video description. You have to be on YouTube in order to read the video description. So if you are watching a video from some other website and this is an embedded link that you're watching, like on Facebook or Twitter or even in the Ravelry group, although if you're in the Ravelry group, it's not as much of an issue. But in particular, if you're on Facebook watching this and you want my help, please go to my Ravelry group, start a new a discussion thread, a new topic, and ask your question there. I can't help people one-on-one through private messaging on Ravelry or through Facebook Messenger. It's just not possible for me to do that. And it also doesn't, it really limits the number of people who can learn from that interaction. If you post a question within my Ravelry group, other people can learn from your question and from the answers, and other people can participate in offering their suggestions as well. Sometimes people ask me questions about things and I have an idea of where they might start in terms of solving their problem, but I may not have direct experience with that particular type of project or that particular situation, but other people in the group do. And at this point, I have about 5,000 people in my Ravelry group, so it's a really nice sized community with a lot of people who are wanting and willing to help. So please, if you want help with the project, that's the way to get it from me. Okay, so the back of the sweater is done. I knit all the way up to the back. Now, the back of the sweater is laid out a little differently than the original pattern because I had to add length. The original pattern did not have 5 stripes up to this point. It had 4. And what it had was the red diamond, and then right here it had a blue V, here was the yellow triangle, and here were the black diagonals. So I knew I needed to add this much extra length to the sweater. And I also had to keep the red and the yellow where they were, and because they were getting repeated up here. So I had to I had to either add a blue V or another black diagonal. And I decided there was already so much black in the sweater and very little blue that what I would do was add a blue stripe. So I reversed the position of these 2 stripes and then I added a blue V at the very bottom. Now, when I originally made this design decision and I told about it in Casual Friday, somebody commented that they preferred the original layout, which is their choice, but they were concerned about the placement of these blue V's and where they would end up being across the bust. So I have finished the 2 sleeves. So the way that this sweater works is that you knit from the bottom up to the armholes, and then you cast on stitches for both of the sleeves, and then you knit all the way across from one wrist to the other until you get up to the back of the neck. And then as you are knitting across here, you bind off the center 17 stitches, and then you continue to the end of the row. And so from that point on, you are knitting only this sleeve. And what's going on with this sleeve is that you have, after you worked the red diamond pattern right here, you have this plain stripe, and in the center of this plain stripe, you bind off 25 stitches, which is 5 inches, and then when you come back on the next row, you cast on. So you're creating these slits, which at the moment are rolling, but they will be have single crochet around, and they're going to help to create the poof of the sleeve at the base. So every time you have one of these kind of plain stripes in the context of the sleeves, you're going to do a slit. So you end up with 3 slits. At the point where this back of the neck is the center stripe of the shoulder and sleeve. And this stripe is a little bit wider than the other stripes. Only this one is a little bit wider than the rest. And then as you are working down the front, you reverse everything. So instead of what we have here, which is a triangle that's pointing down, what you get on this half is a triangle that's pointing down here, but relative to each other, one's pointing this way and one's pointing that way. So you're reversing all of that as you come down. At the same time, you're adding stitches at the neck. So you eliminate 17 stitches at the back of the neck and you add in 18 at the front. Every one of these motifs, the repeat is 18 stitches. So you're essentially taking almost a full repeat out, and you're adding a full repeat in the front of the neck, but then you add in a full repeat on the other side of the neck. So the front is one repeat wider than the back. And this is really common in vintage patterns to have the back larger, or the front larger than the back, to accommodate the extra room needed for the bust. So here I'm about to start the blue V's. I've got these two fronts are complete, and the next row I work will be beginning one of those V's, and that will join these two pieces. They're not really joined together yet. They're actually still separate pieces. So this will be the row that actually joins the two together, and then I will be working the front all the way down. So I want to talk a little bit about how I'm keeping track of what I'm supposed to do in this project, because there are a lot of moving parts to keep track of in terms of where the motifs are placed relative to each other. One motif stripe will have the motifs spaced in a particular way, and then the next stripe, they're offset and centered above them. And then as you increase and cast on a bunch of stitches for the sleeve, then you have to keep track of how many stitches do you work before you start one of those motifs for the sleeves. And that all got complicated because I had to modify the pattern in order to create a larger size. So I needed it to be longer, as I was explaining, but I needed it to be a little bit bigger around, and I also needed the sleeves to be quite a bit longer than they were originally. So I really had to keep track of when to start particular motifs, and to some extent I could tell if I was doing something right based on how they were stacking up relative to each other on a previous row. But when it came to the sleeves, they were so far away from where the established motifs were, I really needed some help. So I did a couple of things. One is that I charted out the whole width of the sweater, and then the additional width of the sleeves, and then placed the motifs in there, and then counted stitches. So if I would know that, okay, I need to start the yellow triangle 6 stitches from the edge when I'm working it on the sleeve. When I was working the next triangle, they were lined up right on top of each other instead of being offset, so that was a little bit easier. But I had a little trouble yesterday when I was finishing up the second sleeve, and I was about to start the last set of red diamonds. Because I have these slits here, I can't just line things up by looking at where they were before. I had to count stitches. And so I was looking at this original red diamond here, and I was counting the number of light colored stitches I had until I got to that diamond. And you can also see the other problem with this is that everything's rolled up, so I can't really see what's going on here. So I was just opening this up right here, and I was counting the number of stitches from the edge to the diamond. And I was starting that last section of diamonds, and I had counted 15 stitches. So it's 1, 2, 3, I knit 15 stitches, and then I placed the very first red stitch for the base of the diamond, and then 17 light colored stitches, and then I placed the next red stitch for the next diamond. And I had them set up, and then I did what I had been doing for the whole sweater. Once I established a new set of motifs, is I stretched out the stitches and I looked at them and made sure that every single one of them was lined up at the midpoint between the two previous motifs. So I had 2 yellow triangles, and I wanted to make sure that the red diamond started right in the middle. And they weren't. They were off by like 4 stitches. And like, what did I do wrong? So I went back and I counted the red diamond at the beginning. That's 15 stitches. That's what I have. It's not working. And then I got really panicked, and I thought, and I shoved it onto my desk, and I just went downstairs and started cleaning the toilets. And I was like, my brain was spinning. I've done something horribly wrong. everything is messed up. It's not going to line up correctly. How am I going to fix this? And so I was going through my mind all of the different ways there are to fix things. Like if you have a problem, many rows before, what can you do? And my go-to strategy is to ladder down a span of stitches. Wherever the mistake is, if there's like 6 stitches across, I just go to those 6 stitches and I let those all drop. I recapture them on a double pointed needle and then I knit them back up again. But the problem with this sweater is that it's an intarsia. And that means it's color block knitting. That means I had a separate ball of yarn for each one of these yellow triangles, for example. But I also had a separate ball of yarn for the light colored parts in between them. And I had woven in the ends for the first half, for the one sleeve I had finished, and then for the first half of this sleeve. And I thought, you can't really effectively ladder down and fix intarsia. Plus I'd woven in the ends. Even if you could, I'd woven in the ends and cut them off. And I wouldn't be able to reuse those spans of yarn. Even if I ripped everything back to the beginning of the sleeves, wherever the mistake was, if I had to rip back all of the sleeves, which just made me sick, I wouldn't be able to reuse any of that yarn. And so, I knew I needed a timeout from the project, which is why I just went, and went downstairs. But I couldn't stand it because I'm like, I don't know how I'm going to fix this because I don't really know what the extent of the problem is. So I came back upstairs and I laid it out. And this edge was all rolled up. So I unrolled it. And I could see that everything was lined up perfectly. Everything was lined up the way it was supposed to. The only thing was the base of these diamonds, which was all I had at the moment, was the first stitch of each of these diamonds. Those were all offset. And I looked at them and I'm like, but they're not lined up with this. Why aren't they lined up with this? Where are they lined up? And what I realized was that when I had counted from the edge of the sleeve to the red diamond, I counted to the point where the diamond was right here, the part that was closest to the edge. And what I needed to do was count from the edge to where the base of the diamond was. And that was why I was off by 4 stitches. So the only problem that I had was the current row that I was still in the middle of, and I could just tink back and then reset and redo it again. But I was in a complete panic because I had all these like, well, if it's really offset, for the entire sleeves, how noticeable is it going to be? It's going to be horrible. I had all of these scenarios going through my head. And then I finally thought, I have to find out what I actually did. And what I did was I just counted stitches on the wrong row and got started wrong. So everything worked out, but it was a huge panic. But I thought I would share with you some of what I am doing to keep track of where I am in this pattern, because there is a lot going on often at the same time. So I might have a stripe where I have a motif going on, or I might have this stripe where there's no motif and I have this split going on. I have increases up at the neck, and the neck increases are not like what you typically see these days. In contemporary patterns, typically you figure out, well, if I need to increase, like in this case, I have 18 increases I need over a period of like 59 rows. Normally what you would do if it was something that was knit flat is that you would arrange to have the increases always appear on the right side row. So in this case, I'm doing increases every 3 rows. So I'll do it on a right side row, and then the next time I'm doing it on a wrong side row, and then the next time on a right side row. So I'm constantly having to keep track of that, because sometimes then it's at an end of a row and sometimes it's at the beginning of a row if it's a right side row versus a wrong side row. And then that switches when you do the other sleeve, because the neck is in the different position relative to where the start and end of the row is. So there was, having to keep track of that every 3 rows, while I was also keeping track of when I needed to do a motif and where I needed to do a motif, and if I needed to do a slit, and all of that kind of stuff. It's too much at the same time instruction. So I included a lot of that in my spreadsheet. I've talked a lot about spreadsheets that I do. Every time I start a project, I create a spreadsheet. Some of them are fairly simple and some of them are more complex. Just depends on the project itself and the kind of information that I need from the project. So I did a video on what I do with spreadsheets, all the different kinds of ways, and how they kind of evolved, how I originally started using them, and then gradually how they evolved over time. So they're a lot more complex, and I'm looking for a lot more information than what I used to do, because one of the things that I want to know at any given time is, how far am I in the project? Like, what are the total number of stitches and where am I right now? What percentage of the way am I? And the reason that I do that is because whenever I start a project, I create a project page in my Ravelry notebook, and one of the things that you can do in your project page is track how far along you are. But you have to tell it. You say, I'm 5%, 10%, 15, or whatever. And a lot of times I had no idea how far I really was, especially in something like a sweater where you have shaping and the pieces are different sizes, and it's really hard to know exactly how far along you really are. And in this sweater, the back is narrower than the front, and then you have these sleeves that come out, so it's a little trickier to know. And then there's all these additional pieces that are crocheted later. So that's the kind of thing where I kind of put the directions in a spreadsheet. I kind of, if I'm casting on, say for the hem, and I'm doing garter stitch, I'll say how many stitches there are and how many rows I'm doing. I have it calculate how many stitches that is, and then I keep a running total of stitches. And then finally, when I get through the whole pattern with all of the shaping and all of the things that need to be done, then I do a complete total, and then I'm able to calculate at any particular point what percentage of the way I am complete. So I thought I would show you the spreadsheet that I'm currently using, because I did some different things in this particular one than what I normally do because of the intarsia motifs and how the color work enters into what I'm doing. This is my spreadsheet, and what I did was I laid it out. I basically indicated how many stitches I was supposed to have to cast on. I am casting on more stitches than the pattern said because I needed to make it a little bit bigger. So this tells me how many stitches I am casting on and for how many rows am I doing that. Well, I'm only casting on for 1 row, and then I have garter stitch. Well, it was 20 rows or 10 ridges, but I tend to break things down a little further, so I have 5 rows 4 different times, just so that as I can keep track of them, I can mark off what I have actually completed. So I tend to break things down a little bit more. So this is where, so I used a smaller needle to begin, and then I switched to the main needle. And I wrote on here, switch to 1 strand, because that's what I thought the original instructions intended. I know now that that this is not the case. It was a fingering weight yarn where you were supposed to use 2 strands throughout, but I just haven't eliminated that instruction from here. So then I ended up color coding so that I could keep track visually and easily in my spreadsheet what was happening in which place, so that I could keep track of it. So I had a black stripe that was 2 rows long, and then I needed to switch to the sand color for 2 rows. And then I have the rows of blue, and I typed in here what my instructions were to get myself established so that I could get things set up correctly, because this would be the first stripe where there was a color motif, and then this red one was the second one where it was being offset. So I really needed to establish these 2 stripes motifs correctly so that everything would be lined up the way it needed to be. And from there, then you get the black stripe with the 6 rows of plain black stripe. And then here's where my black diagonal was, had the yellow triangle, and then again the blue V. So I just have things laid out that way in this particular spreadsheet. And always, however many stitches I have, how many rows I'm doing any one of these particular things, that tells me, this tells me how many stitches I have. This is 89 stitches for 3 rows. That's 267 stitches. If I select that particular cell, you can see that I am doing a calculation, and I'm keeping a running total here. So this total is this one plus however many stitches I have here. So this is doing some formulas here to keep the running total. And then I have here where I'm starting the sleeve with this red diamond, where I'm putting a slit in. Once I bound off for the neck, which is, right here, I'm saying to bind off the center of the neck, then I've reduced the number of stitches I have. And then I'm only working on one sleeve at a time, so the stitch count is changing. And I still have to keep track of where that slit is, and then I have to keep track of the increases. So I have the increases, this is INV, but it's increase, where I'm doing the increases and where that is occurring with the color changes, so that I can make sure that I am keeping on top of these. So this number right here is the total number of stitches for just the knitted part, and then there's all of the stuff I have to do for the cuffs that's crocheted, and so I kept track of those stitch counts, and then all of the little squares I have to do for the collar, and the stitch counts for that. And so I have a grand total stitch count right here, and that is what I use in order to calculate things like the total the total percentage of stitches. So I did do a video before on all the different kinds of spreadsheets that I might do for a project, and that was a Casual Friday video about 1.5 years ago. And the title of that video was called Norwegian Purl for English Knitters. But one of the sections in that video was about my spreadsheets. So if you're interested, there should be a video popping up at some point across the top here that you could go take a look at. So about 4 weeks ago, I went on an online shopping spree, and I was buying vintage knitting manuals. Specifically, I was interested in a set of 8 books that were written by Jane Koster and Margaret Murray back in the 1940s. And I was able to find copies of all 8, and I've still only received 7. The last one is supposed to be here by March 4th at the latest. But I did promise that I would kind of give an overview of these books. So I've gone through and I've looked at all of them, and I wanted to see how they were alike, how they were different, how they were organized, because I could tell by a quick skim that there were a lot of similarities, but there were a lot of differences. And one of the things I was wondering is were there repeated patterns? Were these things where they were recycling patterns, or were there unique patterns from book to book? So I've answered those questions, and what I want to do is do an overhead where I kind of go through these books and talk about the 7 that I have so far, and the context in which they were published, which was the World War II and immediately after, and how they addressed things like rationing, like clothing rationing, which was something that was in effect until 1949 in the UK. So that's what I'm going to do next with the books I have up here. So this is the first book. This was originally published in 1940, and it's called Practical Knitting Illustrated. So if we open it up and we look, there are a variety of sections in here. And what you'll see is up here we have the ABC of knitting and crochet, and that's almost 30 pages long. So there's quite a bit of information about things like casting on and making new stitches. They have information about crocheting, how to do buttonholes, whether you're crocheting them or knitting them. They're having information about cables. They have a couple of different methods of casting on and casting off. So they have a lot of information in here things about edges and how to keep the edge of the knitted garments neat and even. How to do things like putting elastic in. People ask about this, and I have never done it, and they have a couple of different methods for doing it. And you can see that they have it shown in here. And the reason is because they have patterns for underwear in these books, which is kind of surprising. It was surprising to me, like not like underwear that you'd wear over other underwear, but underwear that you'd wear up next to all of your most sensitive parts. So they have information about grafting and doing hems. They have information about different types of needles, how to launder things, making them up. So just a lot of different things about knitting. And in here, what you'll see is they have descriptions of different yarns, and they have photographs of yarns that what I would consider novelty yarns. They don't have photographs of all of the basic yarns. These are photographs of yarns that are special types of yarn so that you can see what they look like. And then in this particular book, they have things segregated by designs for women, household designs, designs for men, designs for babies, and then they have those broken down in different age groups. And then they have at the end designs for children. And at the very end, and then everything's one size. And then they'll tell you the age that this is for. Like, this is the older woman can still look as smart as her daughter, even when she is not so slender. The wide bands of contrasting color which border the classic cardigan are slimming lines for an outsized figure. So, like, nice. Well, so they have things for everybody in the family. Men, women, children, all ages. And they do have some crocheted things. Here you'll see things for the home. And this is where you're most likely to see crocheted items. Almost everything in these books are knitted, which is why they call it Knitting Illustrated, Practical Knitting Illustrated, Modern Knitting, etc. So one of the sections that they have at the end of this book, they have a fairly substantial section. It's about 35 pages long. It's called Ringing the Changes, and they do it in 3 ways. And what they're talking about is modifications. So they're telling you how to change things in size, because everything is only designed for one size in here, regardless of what, if it's a kid, it might be a sweater for a kid 8 to 12 or 8 to 10 or something like that. So they show you on a grid, so one small square represents half an inch. They're showing you how things are laid out on designs on different pages, and then what you do in order to modify them for size. So I think this is really great information. Even if you don't intend to knit something from this book, just this kind of information is really valuable to see how it's laid out and then how you would make those changes. So they have the ringing the changes for size, and then they have for color, and they have ideas for how to change things. They'll have a drawing of a sweater that appears earlier in the book, and then they show an example of what you could do to make changes with, say, for example, embroidery or just stripes or something like that. So they have, and then they have changing shapes. So how you can change a neckline shape, or how you can change other kinds of collars and things like the sleeves, that kind of thing. So this is really, really valuable information. It's not the kind of thing you would see in a book today. And part of that is because of the number of sizes that you would normally see in a book. But a lot of times you need to modify. The length is fine, but you need it bigger around, or the circumference is fine, but you need it longer, and you're not really sure how to do that. And this book actually does a really nice job of that. So this book was published originally in 1940, and it was reprinted multiple times. I think the copy that I have, I think I figured out it was reprinted in 1944. So it was reprinted throughout the 40s. This is the third book. The second book was Knitting for All, published in 1941. I do not have that book yet. It's coming. This is a complete home knitting. It was published in 1942. So in June of 1941, in the UK, clothing rationing was instituted. In the autumn of 1942 was the Make, Do, and Mend was kind of championed by the Board of Trade, I believe it was called. So in this book, there's an actual foreword. And they are talking in here about coupons. They don't mention the war, they don't mention rationing, but they do talk about coupons. And it says, the phrase well-dressed has taken on a new meaning. It means being simply and economically yet charmingly dressed in a spite of restrictions. And you must think hard before you expend the family's coupons, or you'll find gaps in their wardrobes. This book is produced to help you solve your clothes problems. It proves that nearly every garment in the wardrobe can be made from a minimum of yarn with 2 needles and look as though it had been cut out of fabric by a master tailor. And yarn is cheaper in coupons and money. So this book is divided up into women's garments, men's garments, children's, and then new garments from old. And one of the things that they say in the foreword is that they explain to you how to combine fabric and yarn to create garments in case you have some fabric but not enough to make something, or some yarn but not enough to make something, then how you can combine those two things. So this section at the end, again, is about 30 pages long. And I find that this is really, really fascinating. I mean, there's some great vintage outfits in here. That's certainly true, that there's a lot of great vintage patterns in here. But to me, the real gold in this book is this section called New Garments from Old, Reknitting, Renovations, Combining Fabric and Knitting. And so like right here it says, if wool is short, knit yoke and sleeves in stripes. So they'll also recommend things like knitting the sleeves from the top down and then figuring out if you need a different color for the cuffs, that kind of thing. So isn't it charming? And who'd guess it was made out of the sad remains photographed opposite? So they have this little ugly sweater here. But it's so simple. Medallions of contrasting color across the yoke are its only elaboration. For the rest, a simple rib. So they have, they'll show, oh, this is a ripped up cardigan. It's got, holes in it. And they tell you how to make it into something new. And then they talk about going into the knitting with the fabric. So here's a dress that has some knitted sleeves on it and knitted side panels as well. So this is really fascinating to me, that this combination of knitting with fabric that they were championing here. This book also at the beginning has about 30 pages of information that is not the same as the information that was in the first book. Some of it's the same, but some of it is a bit different than what you saw in the first book. And they'll have things like quantities of yarn, different types of yarn needed for different types of garments. So there was no book published in 1943, but in 1944 was Knitted Garments for All. And in this book, again, we have the principles of knitting, but it's the short, how to cast on, how to do the knit stitch. It's like 8-10 pages long, something like that. And then they get right into the women's garments, the men's, the children's, the redos and repairs, renovations, new garments for old, combining wool and material, ringing the changes. So the other books had about 60 pages of information in terms of knitting tips and techniques, and then how to do renovations and repairs and that kinds of thing. This one has a much shorter information about just knitting techniques, but they have a very substantial section on redos and repairs, because this was published in 1944, so they were well into the clothing rationing, so that it became really important to know how to do that. So they have you remodeling without unpicking, so they're telling you how to wash and block things. They tell you what to do if something has been felted. They tell you how to unwind or ravel a sweater and how to reuse the yarn. They include information that I had never heard before, that sometimes when you ravel a sweater, the resulting yarn is thinner than it was originally, so you might need to treat it as if it were a thinner yarn to begin with. So if it originally had been a 4-ply yarn, treat it like it was a 3-ply, knit it on smaller needles at a finer gauge, that kind of information. They tell you how to lay out the proportions of the sleeve so that you can then figure out how to knit it from the top down rather than the bottom up, in case you need to make 3/4 inch or 3/4 length sleeves, or if you need to change to a different color for the cuffs. They have ways of combining colors, so that if you have a little bit of 2 different colors but not enough solid, all the different ways that you can do striping information. And they have a lot of examples of ratty old sweaters that were converted into something else, and sometimes they've been, like this one was even dyed later on. So, or sometimes it's just an ugly sweater. It might be in okay shape, but it's just ugly, and then how you can ravel it and turn it into something new. So they have like 60 pages of this kind of information in this particular book, again, combining knitting with fabric as well. So they also have things about repairing things like socks and gloves and all of that kind of thing. Again, a lot of information in this book about redoing things. This book is called Modern Knitting, and it was originally published in 1945. So most of these books have really cool end pages. The copies I have of some of them don't have plain, but they all have really cool end pages here. This one is it's got women's garments, a small section of men's garments, children's garments, including underwear and stuff, and a household section. And then they have again, principles of knitting, that basic principles of knitting, and then a smaller section on repairs and renovations in this book. So some of the stuff, is really, it's nice looking stuff. It's really classic, and it could be worn today. And some of the stuff is maybe not as wearable today, but really cool to look at. Like that is a pretty cool hat. It's been really interesting and fascinating for me to see the kinds of information that they have in each of these books, particularly the stuff on renovations, but also the stuff that they have on modifications that you don't see in pattern books today. You might see some of that in design books, like if starting from scratch. But that kind of really helpful information on how to make a modification in order to get something to fit you is something that you just don't find very often. It's also interesting to me to see how techniques were used back then compared to how they're used today. In particular, I'm always interested in things like short rows, which I haven't seen much of, if any of it, in these particular books. I'm interested in things like seaming, and they have kind of a balance of the old way of doing things and some newer ways, which aren't really how we would do them today either. Probably not as neat as a mattress stitch would be. And then picking up stitches. They only have information for picking up stitches along a horizontal edge, like for a neckband. And I thought that was really interesting. And I thought, well, why aren't they telling how to pick up along a vertical edge? That's something I'm really curious about. And then I realized that when they are doing cardigans, they specifically say that when you're doing a button band, you should use a smaller needle, but they always do them separately. So they're always knitting the button bands in the same direction that the knitting was done on smaller needles, and then they're sewn on. So that led me to wonder, well, when would they have started doing button bands that were done perpendicularly? Because that is a really common way of doing them today. And so I was asking about that in the vintage group, and a couple of people had some ideas about them. One of them said she noticed the first time was back in the 70s when she saw a button band that was perpendicular to the body. And she thought maybe it had something to do with a wider availability of circular needles, which I thought was really interesting. And it's something that would be needed for a V-neck today, because you'd pick up stitches along one edge, you'd go all the way around the neck and then back down, and you would need a really long needle for that. And back then they would have just done the whole strip and sewn it on that way. But for a round neck, you wouldn't need that. You only need to be able to pick up along the fronts of the cardigan. And maybe it's just, you know, a consistency, like for you do the button bands the same regardless of the style. I don't know. This is an interesting question. It's going to be another thing that I'm kind of looking out for, because clearly in the sweater I'm knitting today, they were, you know, the 1920s sweater where all the stitches for the sleeves are cast on. That's well over 200 stitches that would be crammed on a straight needle. And circular needles were available back then, limited. I have seen a couple of patterns that would call for circular needles. And interestingly, they'll call for a circular needle for the body, but then they'll still want you to use straight needles maybe for this part, or they want you to use double pointed needles for the sleeves. So I have seen occasion where circular needles were called for, maybe earlier even than I expected to see them. But I'm really curious about these button bands, and I'm going to keep an eye out to see if I see them showing up in the 50s or 60s, and if it really is not until the 70s when that happens. That'd be really interesting to find out. So if I didn't mention this already, I will put links down in the video description for a really cool video that was recorded back in the 40s, a fashion show on Make, Do, and Mend. And I will also put a link to a website that has a lot of really interesting historical information about Make, Do, and Mend, photographs and things like that I found really interesting. So that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.